Welcome, my friends, to a rapidly changing Phase 3 of Season of Discovery. Every class seems to be getting a big change in some way or another. From priests and boomkins getting big damage buffs to paladins becoming mana-generating machines for their whole raids, there have been some enormous balance changes. These changes are designed to make the weakest classes a lot stronger and make them more viable. But will it really have the desired effect? And have the long-term implications of these changes been truly considered yet? Let's deep dive into every aspect of the Phase 3 Season of Discovery balancing together. We're going to start off by talking about all the recent balancing changes Blizzard's been doing, and that's really important to do because it sets the tone for what Blizzard's going to be doing in the future, their philosophy, if you will. The first big change is that the Shadow Priests and the Boomkins are getting a 10% damage increase. But the thing is, it's not exactly 10%. So I'm going to distract you by kicking some gnomes while I explain the math. The thing to understand is that the Shadow Form increase from 15 to 25% is not huge. It doesn't affect your sappers, it doesn't affect your pets. What you also have to keep in mind is that it's a multiplicative with your other buffs and your debuffs, which means the total outcome is an 8.7% increase to shadow damage. Not enough to really move the needle in your raids. If you didn't have a Shadow Priest before, you're not going to bring one now. That being said, it makes Shadow Priests even more insane in PvP. As for Boomkins, they actually do get a 10% damage increase. Pretty much works exactly like Darkmoon Fairbuff would. Really nothing changes with Boomkins though. They're still middle of the pack DPS, very terrifying in PvP now though. So for Hunters, what's really changed is the rotation. At 5 stacks of sniper training, aim shot is instant. That means you can fit in an aim shot in between your chimeras. And Chimera got a base weapon percent increase from 120% to 135%. Because of the nature of Hunter Sims, they're not always a 100% reliable picture, and that's because there's just so much movement in an actual raid that can't really be transmitted into a sim. That being said though, it seems like the overall damage increase from all these different buffs is about 200 to 300 for range hunters. That makes hunters really attractive for raids right now, and kind of broken for open world farming as well. As for paladins, they get some big changes. Their Crusader Strike now refreshes their seals, Sacred Shield's up to 60 seconds now instead of 30, and they can Seal Twist now, which should have some big PvP implications. Perhaps the biggest change, though, is the change to Seal of Martyrdom. So now for Paladins, they're generating a huge amount of mana every single swing they're doing. They're dealing 10% of that damage back to themselves. That's converted to mana for their raid at a rate of 133%. That multiplier is so much bigger now. So what that means is your raid is getting an enormous amount of mana. Even one Ret Paladin is almost enough to sustain an entire raid of casters. Basically the same amount as 3 Shamanistic Rages on cooldown. As for long-term implications, definitely going to see more Ret Paladins in raids. At least 2 in every single raid. I do think Rets are going to be scarier in PvP as well. As a priest, that's bad news for me because I'm already terrified of them. As for Shamans, Blizzard's trying to make melee LA Shamans a thing of the past, with mental dexterity only triggering from Storm Strike and Lava Lash. It has an added buff to range LA. Burn increases flame shock damage by 100% and increases dot damage by 6 seconds too. This definitely feels like an attempt to fix the class identity of LA Shamans, because after all, LA Shamans should be at max range one-shotting all of us, not sitting in melee range. Then talking about Rogues, Mutilate spec is pretty much entirely untouched. Instead, Blizzard is trying to make Saber Slash a viable spec. The bleed can stack up to 5 times now, and the bleed effect now increases your Sinister Strike and your Saber Slash impact damage. Ultimately though, unless you just really love swords, most rogues are just gonna keep running Mutilate. And other than those absolute sword-loving fellas, you're really not gonna see any changes in PvP either. Perhaps most importantly though is that Ret Paladins are now generating a huge amount of mana for their raids from Seal of Martyrdom now, so the multiplier has been increased significantly. The outcome is that 1 Ret Paladin is equal to approximately 3 Shamanistic Rages on CD from Shamans. Its enormous mana has extremely far-reaching implications for the endgame as well. So there is one other change that's been happening behind the scenes that nobody talks about, which is scaling. So particularly classes like Warriors scale extremely well, which means they're pulling ahead of other classes just by default. So in that very first week of Sunken Temple, the guilds that went in first, they had mages, they had hunters. That's because those classes leveled the fastest. The result was actually quite a bit of failing. So when our guild went in, we looked at everybody else that was failing, and we brought in our own strategy of diversifying, bringing a lot of support. The Feral Druids, the Resto Druids, The Shadow Priests, the Mages, the Hunters, the Rogues, everything we could think of to maximize our success. And we found success as a result. Having all those supports, having the Innervates, having the Battle Res, it definitely helped us to get the World 11th clear. But immediately after our clear, they heavily nerfed Sunken Temple, about 50%. And with the lower difficulty, and I still think it was very difficult, I had many wipes on my pug runs, it meant that for a lot of guilds, the bosses were loot pinatas. And loot pinatas need maximum damage. You gotta clear those bosses as fast as you can. Everybody wants great parses, they want a speed run. Those things are rewarded by bringing the highest possible damage classes. So within 2 weeks of the phase launching, I could already feel like groups were looking for those maximum damage classes. The Druids, the Paladins, that would have been so amazing that first week, were starting to kind of be shoved out the door. Instead, they were being replaced by more and more warriors. And I guess whoever could support those warriors and amp them up. Now I understand it's only a 20-man raid, and there are only limited spots, but it feels really bad to be a long-time raider, playing that boomkin, playing that healer, and you just get benched because you're no longer necessary, and why not just bring a warrior instead? So in this raid comp section, I really wanted to set the stage for the rest of the video, the problems the game is facing, because it doesn't feel like playing a support role is really rewarded anymore. I'd love to hear your thoughts about what you think if a long-time raider were to be benched from their guild because they don't play that optimal class, the highest damage class. Has it ever happened to you? Do you think it's even a big problem to worry about? It's important now to talk about Blizzard's balancing history. In the original classic WoW, Blizzard would have just sat back and let all the balancing problems happen. There had been plenty of evidence, after all, that in the years of private servers, warriors were the best choice to deal maximum damage. If the classic meta was to stack warriors, was it really Blizzard's place to step in and intervene? Fast forward to 2024 though. We're playing Season of Discovery and Blizzard specifically promised that things would be different. In your endgame raids, you wouldn't be stacking 15 of the same class anymore, let alone warriors. So whether warriors or something else entirely, it really felt like class stacking would be a thing of the past. You could just play whatever you wanted. Except in Phase 3, nothing has changed at all. Class stacking is just as prevalent as ever, perhaps more so than ever. And it really doesn't seem like it'll be changing in Phase 4 either. See, once you cover all the relevant buffs and debuffs, why wouldn't you just bring the highest damage classes possible? It seems like Blizzard's entire balancing approach itself may just be fundamentally flawed. No matter what, as long as there's one class that's the strongest, it just makes more sense to stack that class. So we're left in this strange place where Blizzard can do all the balancing they want, but will it really fix anything? Or is there just a fundamental, deeper problem with the game that no amount of balancing can fix? That ultimately leads us to class utility versus damage, so let's dive into a core problem with the game. So going into our deep dive of the problems facing damage dealers right now, we gotta start with the 10-man raids. It felt like Blizzard's design philosophy was definitely working in the 10-mans. If you wanted to stack a bunch of overpowered melee hunters in BFD, for example, you'd be missing key buffs like Wild Strikes. And if you wanted to drop healers, you might risk out on losing a key buff like Homunculi. And let's say you wanted to cut a mage, you'd be losing your food, your water, your arcane intellect. It just added up. So most of my Phase 1 and even my Phase 2 raids, it just actually looked like a rainbow. But then we got to the 20-man raids. All of a sudden, a huge number of flaws of the classic design started to show themselves. See, pretty much all the relevant buffs and debuffs can be almost entirely covered in a 10-man raid. So when you go up to the 20-man raid, all of a sudden you have 6, 7, 8 slots that could just be duplicates of whatever class happens to be the most damage. So that one spot in the 10-man reserved for the priest with Homunculi, well, it's still one slot, except it's a 20-man raid now. And that doesn't change in a 40-man raid either. What does change is that all those support roles are just getting replaced by damage dealers. And of course that makes perfect sense. More damage means the bosses die faster. That means less concern about mana, less risk of dying, bigger parsing numbers, faster speedruns. Really, the number one incentive that all raid leaders have is to maximize damage as much as humanly possible. The end result is that if you don't provide a 100% necessary buff or debuff for your raid, like Curse of Wreck for example, you're gonna get replaced with a maximum damage character. So we now know that no matter what Blizzard does balance-wise, there's still a core fundamental problem that needs to be resolved in Classic. But we should definitely talk about some of the far-reaching implications of their recent balance changes. The biggest change being mana regeneration in raids. It seems like Blizzard is trying to completely phase mana out of the game. Now, if you're a Horde member like I am, you've probably not had to deal with mana problems for quite some time because of Shamanistic Rage. I know personally I don't even need to go farm Demonic Runes anymore, I don't need major mana pots. Because we do class stacking of Shamans and Warriors, I have plenty of mana. Another big, far-reaching implication of these balance changes we just saw is that your Shadow Priests and your Boomkins are going to be complained about a whole lot in Phase 4. You can already see those Reddit threads forming of people complaining about getting one-shot. While a 10% damage buff won't really move the needle for Shadow Priests and Boomkins in raids, it'll definitely move the needle in PvP. And that's maybe one of my smaller complaints that Blizzard is doing with their balancing. They'll make a small change to something like a Shadow Priest in Phase 3, and then in Phase 4, Shadow Priest will be completely broken. Everybody will complain, they'll have to nerf the class, and that feels really bad. There is one other long-lasting change we're going to be seeing, which is some kind of warrior nerf. And earlier in the video, we talked about how scaling is getting out of control for some classes, particularly warriors. What people are talking about right now, and what Blizzard seems like they might be doing, is rage normalization for warriors. It would really make warrior scaling feel a lot worse, while also making lesser geared warriors more viable. At this point, it feels like rage normalization is inevitable. I am curious what you guys think about it. Do you think it's a good change to make for warriors or not? Okay guys, so we've talked about some of the problems Season of Discovery is facing. Now let's offer some solutions, and of course your feedback is welcome, so definitely put it in the comments. So talking solutions for how to fix the current balance problems facing Season of Discovery, there are a number of options. The first solution is something Blizzard has definitely tried, but they need to lean way more into it. The idea to me is to go in the direction of Instructor Azuvius and Wrath of the Lich King. I'm not saying we should have to bring priests to complete the raid, but reward people for bringing class diversity. It feels like a Talai Defenders was originally that kind of class check, where you needed the priests or the hunters to just get through the fight. I definitely think this is something Blizzard should look into doing more of, and I think it's a very good direction to go down. At the same time, Blizzard could go back to those ideas from No More Gone, where they had certain fights like Thermoplug that were extremely beneficial for ranged. But instead of making it just a range-focused raid, what if Blizzard makes some of the fights range, some of the fights melee? You're rewarded for having a diverse selection of classes. Another option for limiting class stacking would be to play with the loot balancing. So let's say in Phase 4, there's a legendary for every single class, but you'd be able to complete more legendaries if you had a multitude of classes. Ultimately, there isn't really an obvious answer to fixing the balancing problems in Season of Discovery, but I'm sure you have some input as well, so I'd love to hear your feedback in the comments. So we've talked about all the big class changes in Season of Discovery, and some of the hidden changes as well. And also we've talked about how some of these changes may not have the desired effect that Blizzard is hoping for. Undoubtedly, there will be new videos coming on this channel, like an updated DPS tier list in the near future with all the big changes. But really, I'm just excited to see what they'll do next, particularly with that warrior change. Will we end up seeing the rage normalization or not? I'm really curious to hear your thoughts as well on the class balancing. Have you really noticed the class balancing being an issue for your guild, or is it not really a problem for you? While you're here, I really want to say thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video as well. And then check out my ultimate consumables guide, because it feels like people still don't know how to exactly min-max their consumes.